The sun was just beginning to rise over the Illinois prairie when young Abraham Lincoln picked up his heavy axe. His long arms swung the tool high above his head and brought it down with a mighty crack against the thick log. Wood chips flew in all directions as the tall boy worked to split enough rails to build a fence around his family's small farm. Abraham was only 16 years old, but he was already taller than most grown men. His neighbors often stopped to watch him work, amazed by how easily he could split logs that would take other men twice as long to cut. They called him the rail splitter, and the name stuck with him for the rest of his life. This was not the life that most people would expect for a future president. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a tiny one-room log cabin in Kentucky. The cabin was so small that the entire family had to sleep in the same room. There was no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters to keep out the cold winter wind. The floor was made of dirt, and the family owned almost nothing except the clothes on their backs. Abraham's father, Thomas Lincoln, was a poor farmer who could barely read or write. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a kind woman who loved to tell stories. She was the one who first taught Abraham his letters by drawing them in the dirt with a stick. Abraham was hungry to learn more, but there were no schools near their cabin in the wilderness. When Abraham was 7 years old, his family moved to Indiana. They packed everything they owned into a single wagon and traveled for days through thick forests and muddy roads. In Indiana, they built another small cabin and started farming again. Abraham spent most of his time working on the farm, chopping wood, planting crops, and taking care of the animals. Even though Abraham was strong and good at farm work, he dreamed of something different. Every night after finishing his chores, he would sit by the fire and read whatever books he could find. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, encouraged his love of learning. She had brought a few books with her when she married Abraham's father, and these became Abraham's treasures. One of his favorite books was the Bible, which he read over and over again. He also loved a book called Pilgrim's Progress, which told the story of a man's journey to find truth and goodness. Another book that changed his life was a biography of George Washington. Reading about Washington made Abraham dream that maybe someday he could serve his country too. Abraham only went to school for about 1 year total in his entire childhood, but he never stopped learning. He walked miles to borrow books from neighbors, practiced writing with charcoal on a wooden shovel, because his family was too poor to buy paper. He would write out math problems in the dirt and solve them with a stick. The neighbors began to notice that Abraham was different from other farm boys. He could make people laugh with his funny stories, and he could settle arguments between neighbors with his fair and honest words. People started coming to him when they had problems, asking for his advice. When Abraham was 19 years old, he took a trip that changed the way he saw the world. He and a friend were hired to take a flatboat full of goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. This was Abraham's first time leaving Indiana, and he was amazed by all the new sights and sounds. But in New Orleans, Abraham saw something that made him sick to his stomach. He watched as human beings were bought and sold like animals at a slave market. Men, women, and children were forced to stand on a platform, while white men examined them like horses. Families were torn apart as parents were sold to one owner and their children to another. Abraham had heard about slavery before, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. He watched as a strong young man was sold away from his crying wife and children. That day, Abraham made a quiet promise to himself that if he ever had the chance, he would do something to stop this terrible practice. When Abraham returned to Illinois, he was a changed man. He had seen enough of farm life and wanted to try something new. Taught himself law by reading every law book he could find. He borrowed books from lawyers in nearby towns and studied them late into the night by candlelight. In 1834, when Abraham was 25 years old, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and won. People liked his honest way of talking and his ability to solve problems fairly. He served 4 terms in the state legislature, learning how government worked and making friends with other politicians. Abraham also became a lawyer during this time. He would travel from town to town on horseback, carrying his law books in his saddlebags. He became known as Honest Abe because he always told the truth and treated everyone fairly, whether they were rich or poor. In 1842, Abraham married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from Kentucky. They had 4 sons together, though only one would live to become an adult. Abraham was a loving father who enjoyed playing with his children and telling them stories. As Abraham's reputation grew, people began to notice his speeches about slavery. In 1858, he ran for the United States Senate against Stephen Douglas, a famous politician who supported allowing slavery to spread to new states. Abraham and Douglas held 7 debates across Illinois, and thousands of people came to hear them speak. Even though Abraham lost the election, these debates made him famous across the country. People remembered his powerful words about slavery and his belief that all people should be free. He said that America could not survive as a nation that was half slave and half free. Abraham's humble beginnings as a rail splitter had prepared him for the greatest challenge of his life. The poor boy who taught himself to read by firelight was about to become the leader who would save the United States of America and free millions of enslaved people. The prairie lawyer who once split rails with his bare hands was ready to split the chains of slavery forever. The crowd in the convention hall was loud and excited. It was May 1860, and the Republican Party was meeting in Chicago to choose their candidate for president. Most people expected William Seward, the famous senator from New York, to win easily. He had been planning to run for president for years and had many powerful friends. But Abraham Lincoln had other ideas. He sat quietly in the corner, his long legs folded under him, watching and listening. His friends were working hard to convince the delegates that Lincoln was the right choice. They reminded everyone that Lincoln was from Illinois, a state the Republicans needed to win. They also pointed out that Lincoln had no enemies, because he was not well known enough to have made any. On the 3rd day of voting, something amazing happened. Abraham Lincoln, the poor farm boy from Illinois, won the Republican nomination for president. The crowd was shocked. Many people had never even heard of him before. Newspapers called him a dark horse candidate, meaning someone who wins unexpectedly. Lincoln was excited but also worried. He knew that winning the nomination was just the first step. The real challenge would be winning the presidency in November. He knew that if he won, the southern states might leave the Union. The presidential campaign of 1860 was like no other in American history. There were actually 4 different candidates running. The Democratic Party had split into 2 groups because they could not agree about slavery. Stephen Douglas ran for the Northern Democrats, while John Breckinridge represented the Southern Democrats. There was also John Bell, who ran for the Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln barely campaigned at all. In those days, it was considered improper for presidential candidates to give speeches asking for votes. Instead, Lincoln stayed home in Springfield, Illinois, and let his supporters do the campaigning for him. He spent his time meeting with visitors and answering letters. But even though Lincoln was quiet during the campaign, everyone knew what he believed. He had made it clear that he would not allow slavery to spread to new states. He said that slavery was wrong and that America could not continue to be half slave and half free. The southern states were furious. He said that if Lincoln became president, they would leave the United States and form their own country. Newspapers in the South called Lincoln a dangerous man who would destroy their way of life. They warned that his election would mean war. On November 6, 1860, Americans went to vote. Lincoln won the election, but it was a strange victory. He got less than 40% of the total votes, and he did not win a single southern state. In fact, in 10 southern states, Lincoln's name was not even on the ballot. When the news reached the South, the reaction was immediate and angry. South Carolina announced that it would leave the Union. Other southern states began to follow. By the time Lincoln was ready to take office, 7 states had already left. They were forming something called the Confederate States of America. Lincoln was still in Springfield trying to figure out what to do. He had not even become president yet, but the country was already falling apart. He spent long hours in his law office, meeting with advisors and trying to find a way to keep the Union together. Many people suggested that Lincoln should compromise with the South. They said he should promise not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but Lincoln refused. He believed that if he gave in to the South's demands, it would only encourage more states to leave whenever they disagreed with the government. In February 1861, it was time for Lincoln to travel to Washington to become president. This journey would be one of the most dangerous trips any president had ever taken. There were rumors that Southern sympathizers planned to kill Lincoln before he could take office. Lincoln's friends were so worried about his safety that they hired a detective named Allan Pinkerton to protect him. Pinkerton discovered that there really was a plot to assassinate Lincoln. When his train passed through Baltimore, Maryland, The train trip from Springfield to Washington should have been a celebration. Instead, it became a nightmare. At every stop, crowds gathered to see the new president. Some people cheered, but others booed and shouted angry words. Lincoln had to give speeches from the back of the train, trying to calm people's fears. When Pinkerton told Lincoln about the assassination plot in Baltimore, Lincoln wanted to ignore it. He said he was not afraid to die for his country, but his friends convinced him that he had to live to serve as president. So Lincoln agreed to a secret plan. Late at night, Lincoln disguised himself by wearing a soft hat instead of his usual tall hat. He quietly switched trains and traveled through Baltimore while most people were sleeping. When he arrived safely in Washington the next morning, newspapers made fun of him for sneaking into the city like a coward. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the Capitol building to take the oath of office. Sharpshooters were positioned on nearby rooftops in case someone tried to shoot him. The crowd was tense and quiet. In his inaugural address, Lincoln tried to reassure the Southern states. He promised that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. He said he had no intention of invading the South or forcing the Confederate states to return to the Union. But Lincoln also made it clear that he would not recognize the Confederacy as a separate country. He said that the Union was permanent and that no state had the right to leave. He ended his speech with these beautiful words: "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." Despite Lincoln's peaceful words, the situation continued to get worse. The Confederate states had taken over most of the federal forts and buildings in the South. But there was one fort that remained under Union control: Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The soldiers at Fort Sumter were running out of food and supplies. Lincoln faced an impossible choice. If he sent ships to resupply the fort, the Confederates might attack and start a war. But if he abandoned the fort, it would look like he was giving up and accepting the breakup of the United States. Lincoln decided to send supplies to Fort Sumter, but he was very careful about how he did it. He announced that the ships would carry only food and medicine, not weapons or soldiers. He hoped this would show that he was not trying to start a fight. But the Confederate leaders saw things differently. They believed that any attempt to resupply Fort Sumter was an act of war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons began firing on the fort. The Civil War had begun. Abraham Lincoln, the unlikely president who had tried so hard to avoid war, now found himself leading a divided nation into the bloodiest conflict in American history. The sound of cannon fire echoed across Charleston Harbor as Abraham Lincoln stood in the White House staring out the window. It was April 12, 1861, and the news had just arrived that Confederate forces were attacking Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun, and Lincoln knew that everything had changed forever. Lincoln had been president for only 6 weeks, but he already looked older. The weight of leading a nation at war was crushing. Every decision he made would mean life or death for thousands of young men. He had never been a soldier, never commanded an army, and now he was responsible for winning the biggest war in American history. The first challenge was building an army. When the war started, the United States Army had only about 16,000 soldiers, and many of the best officers had joined the Confederacy. Lincoln needed hundreds of thousands of men to fight, and he needed them quickly. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. He and most other people believed the war would be over by summer. Young men rushed to join the army, excited to fight for their country. They marched through the streets of northern cities, while crowds cheered and bands played patriotic songs. But Lincoln soon learned that war was much more complicated than anyone had imagined. The first major battle took place at Bull Run in Virginia on July 21, 1861. Everyone expected the Union Army to win easily. Politicians and citizens from Washington even packed picnic lunches and traveled to watch the battle, as if it were a sporting event. Instead, the Union Army was defeated badly. Soldiers ran away in panic, dropping their weapons and abandoning their equipment. The Confederate Army won a complete victory. When Lincoln heard the news, he realized that this war would last much longer than 3 months. That night, Lincoln walked the floors of the White House, unable to sleep. He had sent those young men to fight, and now many of them were dead or wounded. The responsibility felt overwhelming. He began to understand that being president during wartime meant carrying the weight of every soldier's life on his shoulders. Lincoln threw himself into learning everything he could about military strategy. He borrowed books about war from the Library of Congress and studied them late into the night. He learned about famous battles and great generals from history. He wanted to understand how armies moved and fought so he could make better decisions. But Lincoln's biggest problem was finding good generals. The man he appointed to lead the Union Army was George McClellan, a young officer who looked impressive and spoke confidently. McClellan organized the army well and made the soldiers feel proud to serve. But he had one major weakness. He was afraid to fight. McClellan always believed that the Confederate army was much larger than it really was. He spent months training his soldiers and preparing for battle, but he never actually attacked. Lincoln grew frustrated as McClellan kept asking for more troops and more time. The president wanted action, but his general wanted to wait. Lincoln began visiting McClellan's headquarters regularly, trying to convince him to move faster. Sometimes Lincoln would send telegrams asking, "If you don't want to use the army, I should like to borrow it for a while." But McClellan ignored these hints and continued to delay. While Lincoln struggled with his generals, tragedy struck his own family. In February 1862, his 11-year-old son Willie became sick with typhoid fever. Willie was Lincoln's favorite child, a bright and cheerful boy who loved to read and play with his younger brother Tad. For days, Lincoln and his wife Mary stayed by Willie's bedside, hoping and praying that he would recover. But on February 20th, 1862, Willie died. Lincoln was heartbroken. He had lost his beloved son just as he was trying to save the nation. The death of Willie Lincoln affected the entire family. Mary was so grief-stricken that she could barely function. She stayed in her room for weeks, crying and refusing to see visitors. Lincoln had to take care of his youngest son, Tad, while also running the country and fighting a war. Lincoln found comfort in his work, but the grief never left him. He would sometimes go to Willie's room and sit quietly, remembering happier times. Friends noticed that Lincoln looked sadder and more tired than before. The war and his personal loss were wearing him down. Mary Lincoln's behavior became more and more strange. She held in the White House, trying to communicate with Willie's spirit. She spent huge amounts of money on clothes and decorations while soldiers were dying on battlefields. People in Washington began to gossip about the president's wife, adding to Lincoln's burdens. Meanwhile, the war was not going well. McClellan finally launched an attack on Richmond, the Confederate capital. In the spring of 1862, this campaign was called the Peninsula Campaign because the Union Army approached Richmond from the Virginia Peninsula. At first, it seemed like McClellan might succeed. His army was much larger than the Confederate forces defending Richmond. But once again, McClellan moved too slowly and too carefully. He gave the Confederate army time to bring in reinforcements and prepare their defenses. The Peninsula Campaign ended in failure. After months of fighting and thousands of casualties, McClellan's army was forced to retreat. Lincoln was devastated. He had hoped that capturing Richmond would end the war quickly, but instead, the conflict was getting worse. Lincoln began to realize that this war would require more than just military victories. He started to think that the Union could not win unless it did something about slavery. The Confederate states were fighting to preserve their way of life, which was based on owning other human beings. Lincoln began to believe that the war would only end when slavery ended. This was a difficult decision for Lincoln. He had always said that he wanted to preserve the Union, not necessarily to free the slaves. Many people in the North supported the war to keep the country together, but they did not want to fight to end slavery. Lincoln also worried about the legal issues. The Constitution did not clearly give the president the power to free slaves. If he issued an order ending slavery, would people follow it? Would the Supreme Court say it was illegal? But as Lincoln watched the war drag on and saw more young men die, he began to think that ending slavery might be the only way to win. The Confederate states were using enslaved people to grow food and build fortifications for their army. If Lincoln could free the slaves, it would hurt the Confederate war effort and help the Union. Lincoln began working on a plan to free the slaves, but he decided to wait for the right moment. He needed a Union victory to show that he was acting from strength, not desperation. He also needed to prepare the country for such a dramatic change. As 1862 came to an end, Lincoln had learned many painful lessons about leadership during wartime. He had discovered that being president meant making impossible choices and living with the consequences. He had learned that war was not glorious but terrible, and that victory required sacrifice from everyone. The rail splitter from Illinois had become a wartime president, but the hardest decisions were still ahead of him. Abraham Lincoln sat alone in his office on a hot summer night in 1862, staring at a blank piece of paper. The candle on his desk flickered as he picked up his pen, then set it down again. He had been trying to write the same document for weeks, but the words would not come easily. This paper would change everything. Lincoln was thinking about freeing the slaves. For months, the idea had been growing in his mind like a seed taking root. Every morning when he woke up, he thought about the 4 million enslaved people in the South. Every night before he went to bed, he wondered if he had the right to set them free. The war was not going well for the Union. General McClellan was still moving too slowly, and the Confederate Army seemed to win every major battle. Lincoln knew that something had to change, or the North might lose the war entirely. He began to believe that freeing the slaves might be the key to victory. But Lincoln faced enormous challenges. Many people in the North supported the war to preserve the Union, but they did not want to fight to end slavery. Some Union soldiers had even said they would go home if the war became about freeing slaves. Lincoln worried that in order to end slavery might cause more problems than it solved. There was also the question of whether Lincoln had the legal power to free the slaves. The Constitution protected the rights of property owners, and in 1862, enslaved people were considered property under the law. Lincoln knew that many people would say he was acting like a dictator if he freed the slaves without permission from Congress. Lincoln spent countless hours discussing the issue with his cabinet members. Some, like Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, strongly supported freeing the slaves. Others, like Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, worried that it would hurt the Republican Party in the upcoming elections. Secretary of State William Seward gave Lincoln important advice. He said that if Lincoln announced the end of slavery after a series of military defeats, it would look like an act of desperation. Seward suggested waiting until the Union Army won a significant victory, so that freeing the slaves would appear to be a sign of strength rather than weakness. Meanwhile, pressure was building from many directions. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison had been urging Lincoln to free the slaves since the beginning of the war. They argued that slavery was the root cause of the conflict, and the war could not be won until slavery was destroyed. Religious leaders also pressed Lincoln to act. Ministers wrote letters and visited the White House, telling Lincoln that God wanted him to free the enslaved people. They said that America would never be blessed as long as it allowed human bondage to continue. Even some of Lincoln's generals were asking him to free the slaves. They had seen how enslaved people helped the Confederate war effort by growing food, building fortifications, and working in factories. These generals believed that freeing the slaves would hurt the South's ability to fight. Lincoln also received visits from enslaved people who had escaped to Union lines. These brave men and women told him stories of the horrors of slavery that broke his heart. They described families being torn apart, children being sold away from their parents, and people being beaten for trying to learn to read.
One story particularly moved Lincoln.
A young woman named Sojourner Truth visited the White House and told him about her own experiences as a slave. She had been sold several times and had watched her children taken away from her. She looked Lincoln in the eye and said, "Mr. President, you have the power to set my people free. What are you waiting for?" Throughout the summer of 1862, Lincoln continued to wrestle with the decision. He would walk through the White House late at night, thinking about the millions of people who were counting on him. He prayed about it, asking God to show him the right path. Lincoln also thought about the international implications of freeing the slaves. Great Britain and France were considering recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation, which would have been a disaster for the Union. But Lincoln knew that both countries had already abolished slavery and would be less likely to support the Confederacy if the war became a fight against slavery. By September 1862, Lincoln had made up his mind. He would issue a proclamation freeing the slaves in the rebellious states. But he was still waiting for the right moment, the Union victory that Seward had said was necessary. That moment came on September 17, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. General McClellan's army fought the Confederate forces led by Robert E. Lee. The battle was terrible, with over 22,000 casualties in a single day. But when the fighting ended, Lee's army was forced to retreat back into Virginia. Antietam was not a complete victory for the Union, but it was enough. Lincoln had been waiting for any sign that the war was turning in the North's favor. 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln called his cabinet together for a special meeting. Lincoln entered the room, carrying a folder of papers. He looked tired but determined. He told his cabinet members that he had made a decision that would change the course of the war and the future of America. Lincoln read aloud from the document he had been working on for so long. It was called the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the rebellious states would be forever free. The room was silent as Lincoln finished reading. Then Secretary of War Stanton spoke up and said, "Mr. President, this is the most important document you will ever sign." Lincoln nodded and replied, "I hope and believe it is the right thing to do." The Emancipation Proclamation was not perfect. It only freed slaves in the Confederate States, not in the border states that had remained loyal to the Union. This was because Lincoln was using his war powers as commander-in-chief. He could only act against states that were in rebellion. But despite its limitations, the Emancipation Proclamation changed everything. It transformed the Civil War from a fight to preserve the Union into a moral crusade to end slavery. It gave the war a higher purpose and inspired people around the world to support the Union cause. Lincoln knew that he was taking an enormous risk. He told his secretary, John Hay, "If my name ever goes down in history, it will be for this act. And for this, I hope my whole soul is in it." On New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln sat down at his desk to sign the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation. His hand was shaking slightly. Not from nervousness, but from greeting hundreds of visitors at the White House New Year's reception. Lincoln paused before signing and said, "I never felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." He carefully wrote his full name, Abraham Lincoln, at the bottom of the document. With that signature, Abraham Lincoln became the great emancipator, a president who turned the promise of freedom into reality for millions of enslaved Americans. The summer of 1863 was blazing hot in Washington, but Abraham Lincoln felt cold with worry. General Robert E. Lee and his Confederate Army were marching north into Pennsylvania, bringing the war closer to the nation's capital than ever before. Lincoln paced the floors of the White House telegraph office waiting for news from his generals. Lincoln had finally replaced the cautious General McClellan with a new commander named Joseph Hooker. But Hooker had been badly defeated at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May, and Lee's army seemed unstoppable. Now Lee was invading the North, hoping to win a great victory that might convince European countries to recognize the Confederacy and help end the war. The Confederate Army was moving through Maryland and into Pennsylvania like a gray tide. Towns that had never seen war were suddenly filled with enemy soldiers. Farmers fled their homes, taking their livestock and whatever belongings they could carry. The people of Pennsylvania were terrified that Lee's army would march all the way to Philadelphia or even Washington. Lincoln knew that this invasion could be the turning point of the war. If Lee won a major battle on northern soil, it might force Lincoln to make peace and accept the division of the United States. But if the Union Army could stop Lee and defeat him, it might break the back of the Confederacy forever. On June 28th, Lincoln made another change in command. He replaced General Hooker with George Meade, a steady but unproven general. Lincoln worried about changing commanders so close to a major battle, but he had lost confidence in Hooker's ability to fight Lee. As both armies moved through Pennsylvania, neither side knew exactly where the other was located. It was like two giants feeling around in the dark, trying to find each other. On July 1st, 1863, advance units of both armies accidentally ran into each other near a small town called Gettysburg. Gettysburg was not an important place. It was just a quiet farming community with about 2,400 residents. The town sat at the intersection of several roads, which made it a natural place for armies to meet. Neither Lincoln nor Lee had planned to fight there, but sometimes history chooses its own battlefields. The fighting began early in the morning as Confederate soldiers attacked Union cavalry units west of the town. The sound of gunfire echoed across the peaceful farmland as more and more soldiers rushed to join the battle. By afternoon, thousands of men were fighting desperately in the streets and fields around Gettysburg. In Washington, Lincoln waited anxiously for news. The telegraph lines buzzed with confused reports about the fighting. One message said the Union Army was winning, the next said they were retreating. Lincoln felt helpless as he tried to piece together what was happening 80 miles away. As the first day of fighting ended, the Confederate army had pushed the Union forces back through the town. But General Meade's army took up strong defensive positions on the hills south of Gettysburg. The battlefield looked like a giant fishhook with Union soldiers lined up along the high ground. Lincoln spent a sleepless night on July 1st, walking the halls of the White House and checking for new telegraph messages every few minutes. He knew that the next few days would determine the fate of the nation. If Lee won at Gettysburg, the war might be lost. If Meade could hold his ground and defeat Lee, it might be the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. July 2 brought even more terrible fighting. Lee ordered attacks on both ends of the Union line, hoping to break through and destroy Meade's army. Confederate soldiers charged up hills with names that would become famous: Little Round Top, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill. The fighting was so fierce that the ground was soon covered with bodies. One of the most important moments came when Confederate soldiers nearly captured Little Round Top, a hill that anchored the left end of the Union line. If they had taken it, they could have placed cannons there to destroy the rest of the Union army. But a colonel named Joshua Chamberlain led his Maine soldiers in a desperate bayonet charge that saved the hill and possibly the entire battle. Lincoln received scattered reports about the second day's fighting, but the news was confusing and often contradictory. He knew that thousands of young men were dying, but he did not know who was winning. The waiting was agony for a president who carried the weight of every soldier's life on his shoulders. On July 3rd, Lee made his final, desperate attempt to win the battle. He ordered 15,000 Confederate soldiers to attack the center of the Union line, in what would become known as Pickett's Charge. For over an hour, Union cannons bombarded the Confederate positions. Then the gray-clad soldiers emerged from the woods and began their long march across an open field toward the Union lines. It was one of the most tragic and heroic sights in American history. The Confederate soldiers marched forward in perfect formation, knowing they were walking toward almost certain death. Union soldiers watched in amazement as their enemies advanced with incredible courage across 3/4 of a mile of open ground. The courage was not enough to overcome the Union Army's strong position and superior firepower. As the Confederate soldiers got closer to the Union lines, artillery and rifle fire tore through their ranks. Men fell by the hundreds, but those who could still walk kept moving forward. Only a few hundred Confederate soldiers actually reached the Union lines, and they were quickly killed or captured. Pickett's charge had failed completely, and Lee's army was shattered. More than half of the men who had made the charge were dead, wounded, or missing. When Lincoln finally received word that Lee's attack had been repulsed, he felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The Union had won a great victory, but the cost had been terrible. Over 50,000 men from both armies had been killed, wounded, or captured in just 3 days of fighting. Lee began retreating toward Virginia on July 4th. Independence Day. His invasion of the North had failed, and his army would never again be strong enough to threaten Washington or invade Northern territory. The tide of war had finally turned in favor of the Union, but Lincoln was frustrated that General Meade did not pursue Lee's retreating army more aggressively. Lincoln believed that Meade had a chance to destroy Lee's army completely and end the war. Instead, Lee escaped back to Virginia to fight another day. Despite his disappointment with Meade's caution, Lincoln knew that Gettysburg was a turning point. The Union had proven that it could defeat Lee's supposedly invincible army. The victory also convinced European countries not to recognize the Confederacy, keeping them out of the American conflict. For months after the battle, Lincoln was invited to speak at the dedication of a national cemetery at Gettysburg. The main speaker was supposed to be Edward Everett, a famous orator, who was expected to give a 2-hour speech. Lincoln was asked to make just a few brief remarks. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg by train. He was feeling sick with a fever, but he was determined to honor the men who had died there. As the train rolled through the Pennsylvania countryside, Lincoln worked on his speech, writing and rewriting the words on a piece of paper. When Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg, he was amazed by how normal the town looked. The bodies had been buried, and most of the battle damage had been repaired. But Lincoln knew that this peaceful place had been the scene of one of the most important battles in American history. The dedication ceremony took place on a hill overlooking the battlefield. Thousands of people had come to hear the speeches and honor the dead. Edward Everett spoke for 2 hours, giving a detailed account of the battle and praising the soldiers who had fought there. Then Lincoln stood up to speak. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a black suit and his familiar stovepipe hat. In his high, clear voice, he began with the words that would echo through history. For 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln spoke for only 2 minutes, but his 272 words transformed the meaning of the Civil War. He said that the living could not consecrate the battlefield because the dead soldiers had already done so with their sacrifice. He called on the nation to ensure that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that America would experience a new birth of freedom. When Lincoln finished speaking, the crowd was silent for a moment. Some people were not sure what to think of such a short speech. But Edward Everett understood the power of Lincoln's words. He told the president, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." The Gettysburg Address became one of the most famous speeches in American history. Lincoln had taken a military cemetery dedication and turned it into a redefinition of American democracy. He had shown that the war was not just about preserving the Union, but about ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people would survive. The Battle of Gettysburg and Lincoln's immortal words had given the war new meaning, and the Union new hope. The rail splitter from Illinois had become a poet of democracy, and his words would inspire people fighting for freedom around the world for generations to come. Abraham Lincoln sat at his desk in the White House on a cold March morning in 1864, reading reports from a general he had never met in person. The papers described victories in Tennessee and Mississippi battles won by a man who seemed to understand what Lincoln had been trying to tell his other generals for 3 long years. Wars are won by fighting, not by making excuses. The general's name was Ulysses S. Grant, and Lincoln was thinking about giving him command of all the Union armies. Grant was different from the other generals Lincoln had tried. While McClellan, Hooker, and Burnside had all found reasons to delay and retreat, Grant kept moving forward and winning battles. Lincoln had been searching for the right general since the war began. He had tried many commanders, but they all seemed to have the same problem. They were too careful, too worried about losing, too ready to give up when things got difficult. Lincoln needed someone who would fight until the war was won, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. Grant had first caught Lincoln's attention with his victories in the western part of the country. In February 1862, Grant had captured Fort Donelson in Tennessee, taking 15,000 Confederate prisoners. When the Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender, Grant had replied, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." This tough response earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. But Grant's reputation had suffered after the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. His army had been surprised by a Confederate attack and nearly defeated before winning on the second day. Many people blamed Grant for the heavy casualties and said he had been drinking alcohol. Some politicians demanded that Lincoln fire him. Lincoln refused to give up on Grant. When people complained about Grant's drinking, Lincoln supposedly said, "Find out what brand of whiskey Grant drinks, because I want to send a barrel of it to my other generals." Lincoln cared more about results than rumors, and Grant got results. The turning point for Grant came with his campaign to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy because it controlled the Mississippi River from high bluffs. As long as the Confederates held Vicksburg, they could move supplies and soldiers across the great river. Grant spent months trying different ways to capture the city. He tried attacking from the north, from the south, and from the river. Nothing worked. The city seemed impossible to take. Other generals might have given up, but Grant kept trying new approaches. Finally, Grant came up with a bold plan. He marched his army down the west side of the Mississippi River, then crossed south of Vicksburg. This cut his army off from its supply lines, but it also put him in position to attack the city from the land side, where it was weaker. Grant's army lived off the land as they fought their way toward Vicksburg. They captured the Mississippi state capital of Jackson, then turned west toward their real target. The Confederate army defending Vicksburg was trapped inside the city, unable to escape or get help. Grant laid siege to Vicksburg for 47 days. His soldiers dug trenches closer and closer to the city walls, while his cannons pounded the defenders day and night. The people of Vicksburg were forced to live in caves to escape the bombardment. Food became so scarce that people ate rats and mules to survive. On July 4, 1863, the same day that Lee was retreating from Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. The entire Confederate Army, nearly 30,000 men, became prisoners. More importantly, the Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River. As Lincoln said, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Lincoln was impressed by Grant's determination and success. Here was a general who did not make excuses or ask for more troops. Grant saw what needed to be done and did it, regardless of the obstacles. Lincoln began to think that Grant might be the man to end the war. In November 1863, Lincoln sent Grant to rescue the Union Army trapped in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Confederate Army had surrounded the city and was starving the Union forces into surrender. Previous commanders had failed to break the siege, but Lincoln believed Grant could find a way. Grant arrived in Chattanooga and immediately began planning an attack. The Confederate Army held the high ground on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, positions that seemed impossible to assault. But Grant was not intimidated by difficult situations. The Battle of Chattanooga lasted 3 days in late November 1863. Grant's forces attacked on multiple fronts, using clever tactics to overcome the Confederate advantages. The most dramatic moment came when Union soldiers charged up Missionary Ridge without orders, carrying their flags to the top of the mountain and routing the Confederate Army. The victory at Chattanooga opened the way for Union forces to invade Georgia. More importantly for Lincoln, it proved that Grant was the kind of general he needed. Grant did not hesitate or make excuses. He attacked and kept attacking until he won. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant was only 41 years old and had been unknown just 3 years earlier. Now he commanded over 500,000 soldiers in the largest military force America had ever assembled. Now Grant came to Washington to meet Lincoln for the first time. The two men could not have been more different in appearance. Lincoln was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and sad eyes. Grant was short and stocky, with a beard and a simple uniform that often looked rumpled, but they understood each other immediately. Lincoln told Grant that he did not want to interfere with military operations. All he wanted was for Grant to win the war as quickly as possible. Grant assured Lincoln that he would keep attacking until the Confederacy surrendered. No more delays, no more excuses, no more requests for more troops or better weather. Grant's strategy was simple but brutal. He would attack the Confederate armies everywhere at the same time, giving them no chance to rest or reinforce each other. He called it a simultaneous advance on all fronts. Lincoln liked the plan because it used the Union's advantage in numbers and resources. The campaign began in May 1864, with Grant leading the Army of the Potomac against Lee's forces in Virginia. At the same time, Sherman's army would march through Georgia toward Atlanta, and other Union forces would attack in Louisiana and the Shenandoah Valley. The fighting in Virginia was more terrible than anything the war had seen before. Grant and Lee fought a series of battles through the wilderness, a thick forest where soldiers could barely see each other through the trees. The Battle of the Wilderness lasted 2 days and cost both armies thousands of casualties. In previous campaigns, Union generals had retreated after such heavy losses. But Grant did something different. Instead of falling back, he ordered his army to move south, closer to Richmond. When his soldiers realized they were advancing rather than retreating, they cheered. Finally, they had a general who would not give up. The armies fought again at Spotsylvania Courthouse, where Grant lost 18,000 men in 2 weeks of fighting. The casualties were staggering, but Grant kept moving south. He telegraphed Lincoln, "I propose to fight it out on this line, if it takes all summer." The bloodiest single day came at Cold Harbor on June 3, 1864. Grant ordered a frontal assault on Lee's entrenched positions, and 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded in less than an hour. It was one of Grant's worst tactical mistakes, and he later said he regretted ordering the attack. But even after Cold Harbor, Grant did not retreat. He moved his army south of Richmond and began a siege of Petersburg, a railroad junction that supplied the Confederate capital. If Grant could capture Petersburg, Richmond would have to surrender. He moved his army south of Richmond and began a siege of Petersburg, a railroad junction that supplied the Confederate capital. If Grant could capture Petersburg, Richmond would have to surrender. Many people in the North criticized Grant for the heavy casualties. They called him a butcher who cared nothing for his soldiers' lives. Newspapers published long lists of the dead and wounded, and families grieved for sons who would never come home. Lincoln faced enormous pressure to fire Grant and find a more cautious general. The 1864 presidential election was approaching, and many voters were tired of the war's cost in blood and money. Democrats nominated George McClellan, promising to negotiate peace with the Confederacy. But Lincoln stood by Grant, even when his own political future was at stake. Lincoln understood that Grant's aggressive tactics were the only way to end the war. Every day the fighting continued meant more deaths on both sides. The quickest way to save lives was to win the war as soon as possible. Lincoln also recognized that Grant was fighting a different kind of war. Previous generals had tried to capture territory or win individual battles. Grant was trying to destroy the Confederate Army's ability to fight. He knew that the South could not replace its losses as easily as the North could. As 1864 continued, Grant's strategy began to work. Sherman captured Atlanta in September, giving Lincoln's re-election campaign a huge boost. Other Union armies won victories across the South. The Confederacy was being squeezed from all directions, just as Grant had planned. Lincoln was re-elected in November 1864, partly because voters could see that Grant was finally winning the war. The president, who had searched for 3 years to find the right general, could now see victory on the horizon. Grant had given Lincoln something no other general had provided: the confidence that the war would end in Union victory. The partnership between the prairie lawyer and the failed businessman-turned-general would soon bring the bloodiest conflict in American history to its conclusion. Many people in the North criticized Grant for the heavy casualties. They called him a butcher who cared nothing for his soldiers' lives. Newspapers published long lists of the dead and wounded, and families grieved for sons who would never come home. Lincoln faced enormous pressure to fire Grant and find a more cautious general. The 1864 presidential election was approaching. Many voters were tired of the war's cost in blood and money. Democrats nominated George McClellan, promising to negotiate peace with the Confederacy. But Lincoln stood by Grant, even when his own political future was at stake. Lincoln understood that Grant's aggressive tactics were the only way to end the war. Every day the fighting continued meant more deaths on both sides. The quickest way to save lives was to win the war as soon as possible. Lincoln also recognized that Grant was fighting a different kind of war. Previous generals had tried to capture territory or win individual battles. Grant was trying to destroy the Confederate Army's ability to fight. He knew that the South could not replace its losses as easily as the North could. As 1864 continued, Grant's strategy began to work. Sherman captured Atlanta in September, giving Lincoln's re-election campaign a huge boost. Other Union armies won victories across the South. The Confederacy was being squeezed from all directions, just as Grant had planned. Lincoln was re-elected in November 1864, partly because voters could see that Grant was finally winning the war. The president, who had searched for 3 years to find the right general, could now see victory on the horizon. Grant had given Lincoln something no other general had provided: the confidence that the war would end in Union victory. The partnership between the prairie lawyer and the failed businessman-turned-general would soon bring the bloodiest conflict in American history to its conclusion. The spring of 1865 brought warm sunshine to Virginia, but the Confederate Army was dying slowly in the trenches around Petersburg. General Grant's siege had lasted 9 long months, and Lee's soldiers were hungry, tired, and running out of hope. Abraham Lincoln could feel that victory was finally within reach, but he worried about what would happen when the war ended. Lincoln had been thinking about peace for months. He knew that winning the war was only half the job. The harder task would be bringing the southern states back into the Union and healing the terrible wounds that 4 years of fighting had created. Lincoln wanted to be generous to the defeated South, but many people in his own party demanded harsh punishment. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln gave his second inaugural address on the steps of the Capitol. The crowd that gathered to hear him was different from the one that had listened to his first speech 4 years earlier. Then, the nation had been breaking apart. Now, everyone could see that the Union was going to win. But Lincoln did not speak like a conquering general, celebrating victory. Instead, he talked about forgiveness and healing, said that both North and South had suffered terribly, and that God had allowed the war to continue until slavery was completely destroyed. He ended with words that would become famous: "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds." Many Republicans were surprised by Lincoln's gentle tone. They wanted him to promise that the South would be punished for starting the war. But Lincoln believed that revenge would only create more hatred and make it harder to reunite the country. He told his friends, "We must extinguish our resentments if we expect harmony and union." As March turned to April, Grant's siege of Petersburg was finally working. Lee's army was trapped and starving. Confederate soldiers were deserting every night, slipping away to return to their families.
Ice.
Those who remained were too weak from hunger to fight effectively. On April 2, 1865, Grant launched a final assault that broke through Lee's lines. The Confederate army began retreating toward the west, hoping to escape and continue fighting somewhere else. But Grant's forces were faster and stronger, and they cut off most of Lee's escape routes. The news reached Lincoln in Washington on April 3rd. Richmond, the Confederate capital, had fallen at last. Lincoln decided to do something that amazed everyone. He would travel to Richmond to see the captured city for himself. Many people thought Lincoln was crazy to visit Richmond so soon after its capture. The city might still be dangerous, with Confederate sympathizers who would love to harm the president, but Lincoln was determined to go. He wanted to see the end of the rebellion with his own eyes. Lincoln arrived in Richmond on April 4th, traveling up the James River on a small boat because the harbor was still filled with wrecked ships and underwater mines. As he walked through the streets of the Confederate capital, an amazing thing happened. Thousands of formerly enslaved people came out to see him. The freed slaves recognized Lincoln immediately. They had heard about the Emancipation Proclamation, and they knew that this tall, sad-looking man was the one who had set them free. Many fell to their knees as he passed, calling him their savior and reaching out to touch his clothes. Lincoln was deeply moved by this reception, but he was also uncomfortable with people kneeling before him. He told them to stand up, saying, "Don't kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only, and thank him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." Lincoln spent several hours touring Richmond, visiting the Confederate White House where Jefferson Davis had lived and worked. He sat in Davis's chair and looked out the windows at the city that had been the heart of the rebellion. But Lincoln showed no signs of triumph or revenge. Instead, he seemed sad about all the destruction the war had caused. Meanwhile, Lee's army continued its desperate retreat across Virginia. Grant's forces pursued them relentlessly, fighting small battles every day. Lee hoped to reach the mountains where his army might be able to hide and continue fighting, but Grant was closing in from all sides. On April 7th, Grant sent Lee a message asking him to surrender. Grant wrote, "The result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance." But Lee was not ready to give up yet, replied that he did not think his situation was hopeless and would continue fighting. But Lee's situation was indeed hopeless. His army was surrounded near a small town called Appomattox Courthouse. On the morning of April 9th, Lee tried one last attack to break through the Union lines. When that failed, he knew there was nothing left to do but surrender. Lee sent a message to Grant asking to meet and discuss terms of surrender. The two generals agreed to meet at the home of Wilmer McLean in Appomattox Courthouse. By a strange coincidence, McLean had moved to this quiet town to escape the war after the First Battle of Bull Run had been fought on his property in 1861. The meeting between Lee and Grant was one of the most important moments in American history. Lee arrived wearing his best uniform with a jeweled sword at his side. Grant came dressed in a simple soldier's uniform, muddy from traveling with his troops. Grant treated Lee with great respect and dignity. He did not gloat over his victory or humiliate the defeated Confederate general. Instead, he offered generous terms of surrender. Confederate officers could keep their swords and personal horses. All soldiers could go home and would not be punished for fighting against the Union. Lee was grateful for Grant's kindness. As he prepared to leave, Grant did something that showed the spirit Lincoln had called for in his inaugural address. He told his soldiers to stop celebrating because the war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. When Lincoln heard the news of Lee's surrender, he was filled with joy and relief. The long nightmare was finally over. He ordered a celebration in Washington, with bands playing and cannons firing in salute. But even in his moment of triumph, Lincoln was thinking about the future. On April 11th, Lincoln gave his last major speech from a window of the White House. He talked about the challenges of construction and his plans for bringing the southern states back into the Union. He even suggested that some black men, especially those who had fought for the Union or could read and write, should be given the right to vote. This was a radical idea in 1865, and it made some people very angry. In the crowd listening to Lincoln's speech was an actor named John Wilkes Booth, who hated everything Lincoln represented. When he heard Lincoln talk about voting rights for freed slaves, Booth turned to his friend and said, "That means citizenship for blacks. That is the last speech he will ever make." Lincoln had no idea that his generous vision for peace was making enemies, who would soon try to destroy everything he had worked to achieve. He went to bed on April 11th, believing that the hardest part of his presidency was over, and that he could now focus on healing the nation's wounds. The president who had saved the Union and freed the slaves was about to face his greatest test, though he did not know it yet. The road to Appomattox had ended in victory, but Lincoln's own journey was about to take a tragic turn that would transform him from a successful president into an American martyr. April 14, 1865, was Good Friday, and Washington was celebrating like never before. Church bells rang throughout the city, and people danced in the streets. The Civil War was over, and Abraham Lincoln had saved the Union. After 4 long years of death and suffering, Americans could finally look forward to peace. Lincoln woke up that morning, feeling happier than he had in years. The terrible weight that had pressed down on his shoulders since the war began was finally lifting. He had breakfast with his family and spent the day meeting with government officials, making plans for rebuilding the South and bringing the Confederate States back into the Union. But Lincoln was also very tired. The war had aged him terribly. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his hair had turned gray. Friends noticed that he looked much older than his 56 years. The stress of leading the nation through its greatest crisis had taken a heavy toll on his health. That evening, Lincoln and his wife Mary decided to go to Ford S. Theater to see a play called Our American Cousin. It was a comedy, and Lincoln was looking forward to laughing after so many years of sorrow. Several other people had been invited to join the president's party, but most had declined. In the end, only Lincoln, Mary, and a young engaged couple named Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris went to the theater. Mary Lincoln had a bad feeling about going out that night. She tried to convince her husband to stay home, saying she was worried about his safety, but Lincoln told her not to worry, said that the people of Washington loved him now that the war was over, and there was nothing to fear. Lincoln was wrong. In the shadows of the city, a small group of Confederate sympathizers was planning to kill him. Booth was handsome and talented, but he was also filled with hatred for Lincoln and everything the president represented. Booth had originally planned to kidnap Lincoln and trade him for Confederate prisoners. But when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Booth decided that only assassination could save the Southern cause. He believed that killing Lincoln would throw the government into chaos and somehow allow the Confederacy to continue fighting. Now Booth was not acting alone. He had convinced several other men to help him with a plan to kill not only Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. By murdering the top 3 leaders of the government on the same night, Booth hoped to destroy the Union's ability to govern. The president's party arrived at Ford's Theater around 8:30 that evening. When people in the audience saw Lincoln enter his box, they stood up and cheered. The orchestra played Hail to the Chief, and Lincoln bowed to acknowledge the applause. He looked relaxed and happy as he settled into his rocking chair to watch the play. Lincoln enjoyed the comedy, laughing loudly at the funny lines. It was wonderful to see the president enjoying himself after so many years of worry and sadness.
Owls.
Mary held his hand as they watched the actors on stage. For a few hours they could forget about the burdens of leadership and just be a married couple enjoying an evening out. But John Wilkes Booth was also in the theater that night. As a famous actor, he knew the building well and could move around without attracting attention. He had spent the day drinking heavily and working up his courage for what he planned to do. Booth knew the play Our American Cousin by heart, because he had performed in it many times. He knew exactly when the audience would be laughing loudest at a particular joke. That would be the perfect moment to strike, when the sound of the gunshot would be covered by the laughter. Around 10:15 that night, Booth made his move. He climbed the stairs to the balcony level and walked toward the president's box. The guard who was supposed to be protecting Lincoln had left his post to get a drink at a nearby saloon. Booth easily slipped into the box behind the president. Lincoln was leaning forward in his chair, watching the play and holding Mary's hand. He had no idea that death was standing just a few feet behind him. Booth pulled out a small pistol and aimed it at the back of Lincoln's head. On stage, the actor Harry Hawk delivered the line that always got the biggest laugh. Well, guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sockdologizing old man-trap? The bullet entered Lincoln's head behind his left ear and lodged near his right eye. The president slumped forward in his chair, unconscious. Mary screamed and reached for her husband, not understanding what had happened. Booth jumped from the president's box onto the stage, but he caught his spur on a flag and broke his leg when he landed. Despite the pain, he stood up and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "thus always to tyrants" in Latin. It was the motto of Virginia and the cry of Caesar's assassin. Then he limped off the stage and escaped on a horse he had waiting outside. The theater erupted in chaos. People screamed and ran for the exits. Some thought the shooting was part of the play until they saw Mary Lincoln's anguish and the blood on the president's head. A young doctor named Charles Lyell rushed to Lincoln's aid, but he could see immediately that the wound was fatal. Lincoln was too badly injured to be moved back to the White House. Instead, they carried him across the street to a boarding house owned by William Peterson. They laid the unconscious president on a bed that was too short for his long body, and doctors worked desperately to save his life. But there was nothing they could do. The bullet had torn through Lincoln's brain, and he was slowly dying. His breathing became more and more labored as the night went on. Mary sat beside the bed, holding his hand and begging him to speak to her, but Lincoln never regained consciousness. Government officials rushed to the boarding house when they heard the news. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took charge of the situation, sending soldiers to search for Booth and his conspirators. As dawn approached on April 15th, Lincoln's breathing became weaker and weaker. At 7:22 in the morning, exactly 4 years after the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln died. Stanton spoke the words that became famous. Now he belongs to the ages. The news of Lincoln's assassination spread quickly across the country by telegraph. In cities and towns throughout the North, people gathered in the streets to weep and pray. Church bells tolled mournfully, and flags were lowered to half-staff. The nation that had been celebrating just hours before was now plunged into grief. John Wilkes Booth had thought that killing Lincoln would help the South, but he was completely wrong. Instead of creating chaos, Lincoln's death united the North in anger and determination. The generous peace that Lincoln had planned for the South was replaced by a much harsher Reconstruction led by men who wanted to punish the defeated Confederacy. Booth himself was hunted down and killed by Union soldiers 12 days after the assassination. His conspirators were captured, tried, and executed. But the damage was done. The one man who might have healed the nation's wounds and brought North and South together in peace was gone forever. Abraham Lincoln died at the moment of his greatest triumph, just as he was preparing to bind up the nation's wounds and create a just and lasting peace. His assassination turned him from a successful but controversial president into a martyred savior of the Union and liberator of enslaved people. The funeral train that carried Abraham Lincoln's body from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, was like nothing America had ever seen. For 12 days in April and May 1865, the train slowly made its way across 7 states, stopping in major cities so that millions of people could say goodbye to their fallen president. In every city where the train stopped, enormous crowds gathered to pay their respects. In Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets as Lincoln's casket was carried through the city. Many people had traveled for days just to see the funeral procession. They came on foot, on horseback, and in wagons, bringing their children so they could tell their grandchildren that they had been there. The funeral train finally reached Springfield on May 3, 1865. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, the same place where his beloved son Willie had been laid to rest 3 years earlier. The prairie lawyer who had split rails as a young man had come home at last, but his journey into immortality was just beginning. Even before Lincoln's body was buried, people began to understand that something extraordinary had happened. The poor farm boy who had taught himself to read by candlelight had become more than just a successful president. His assassination had transformed him into a symbol of everything good and noble about America. Lincoln's words became sacred texts for Americans. School children memorized the Gettysburg Address and recited it in classrooms across the country. This phrase about government of the people by the people. For the people became the definition of democracy that people around the world could understand and admire. The Emancipation Proclamation made Lincoln a hero to freed slaves and their descendants. African American families hung pictures of Lincoln in their homes, next to images of Jesus Christ. They called him Father Abraham and taught their children that Lincoln had sacrificed his life to set them free. But Lincoln's legacy grew far beyond America's borders. People fighting for freedom in other countries began to quote Lincoln's speeches and use his example to inspire their own struggles. When rebels fought against kings and emperors, they remembered Lincoln's words about equality and democracy. In 1922, 57 years after Lincoln's death, the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in Washington. The massive marble temple sits at one end of the National Mall, with a giant statue of Lincoln looking out over the city he had saved. Carved into the walls are the words of the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's second inaugural address. The memorial became a place where Americans came to remember their highest ideals. When the opera singer Marian Anderson was denied the right to perform at Constitution Hall because she was black, she sang instead on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1939. Her beautiful voice carried Lincoln's message of equality to 75,000 people who came to hear her. In 1963, nearly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Martin Luther King Jr. stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial to deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He began by saying, 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. King was using Lincoln's memory to call for the completion of the work that Lincoln had started. Presidents throughout American history have turned to Lincoln for inspiration and guidance. Franklin Roosevelt kept a portrait of Lincoln in his office during World War II, drawing strength from Lincoln's example of leadership during a national crisis. John F. Kennedy quoted Lincoln's words about malice toward none and charity for all. Barack Obama announced his presidential campaign in Springfield, Illinois, standing on the steps of the old state capitol where Lincoln had once served. Lincoln's influence spread far beyond politics. Writers, artists, and filmmakers have told his story countless times, each generation finding new meaning in his life and death. Thousands of books have been written about Lincoln, more than any other American except George Washington. But perhaps the most important part of Lincoln's legacy is the question that Americans still ask themselves when facing difficult decisions. What would Lincoln do? In times of crisis, people look back to the prairie lawyer who saved the Union and freed the slaves, hoping to find wisdom in his example. Lincoln's belief in the power of education inspired the creation of land-grant colleges that brought higher education to ordinary Americans. His vision of a united country led to the Transcontinental Railroad that connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. His commitment to democracy helped establish America as a beacon of hope for oppressed people around the world. Lincoln's legacy also includes the complex challenge of racial equality that America is still working to achieve, while Lincoln freed the slaves. Full equality for African Americans remained an unfinished task that later generations would have to complete. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was, in many ways, an effort to fulfill the promise of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Today, more than 160 years after Lincoln's birth, his words still inspire people fighting for justice and equality. When protesters march for civil rights, when immigrants seek freedom in America, when people around the world struggle against dictatorship, they often carry signs with Lincoln's words or invoke his memory. Lincoln's image appears on the penny and the $5 bill, but his real monument is the America he helped create. The United States survived its greatest crisis because Lincoln had the courage to preserve the Union and the wisdom to give that preservation a moral purpose by ending slavery. Lincoln proved that democracy could survive even when tested by civil war. He showed that a country founded on the idea that all people are created equal could live up to its promises, even when doing so required enormous sacrifice. He demonstrated that ordinary people given the chance could rise to extraordinary greatness. The rail splitter who became president taught America that its strength comes not from its armies or its wealth, but from its commitment to the idea that government should serve the people, not the other way around. He showed that true leadership means doing what is right even when it is difficult, unpopular, or dangerous. Lincoln's greatest legacy may be his faith in the American people themselves. He believed that ordinary citizens, if given the truth and the chance to choose, would make the right decisions. He trusted democracy even when democracy seemed to be failing. And he never gave up hope that America could become the country its founders had envisioned. Abraham Lincoln died more than 150 years ago, but his spirit lives on in every American who believes in equality, justice, and democracy. His words continue to inspire. His example continues to guide. And his vision of America as the last best hope of Earth continues to challenge each new generation to build a more perfect union. The poor boy from Kentucky who taught himself to read became immortal, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to grow, to learn, and to sacrifice everything for the principles he believed in. In saving the Union and freeing the slaves, Abraham Lincoln saved the idea of America itself, ensuring that government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth.